March 30th, 2022. It's the last day for Sprint as we know it. At midnight on that day, Sprint's 3G towers will be shut down, marking the end of the most enduring mobile phone standard and the end of the beginning of digital wireless phone service. Cowboys rode the Chisholm Trail from the Rio Grande up to the Mexican border and Texas to Abilene, Kansas, where a marshal was a fellow named Wild Bill Hickok. What we know of today as the Union Pacific would take cattle 2,000 at a time to Kansas City, where the Santa Fe Railroad took them to points east. Abilene was the first cow town in the American West, located about 150 miles west of Kansas City. Abilene was also right on the Oregon Trail, but no wagon would dare stop there. Those who did settle in this dangerous, dusty, little uncomfortable burg did well. Someone had to run the hotel, make the ice, doctor the sick, and so on. It's the kind of place you'd see in the Westerns. Hot, windy, everything was unrelenting, like our version of the Outback. The next city west of Abilene was Denver, Colorado, but it was several days' ride. It was around this time that Abilene's population peaked at 6,000, or 8,000 if you include the cows. Yes, this was a rugged place for individuals who didn't care much for the laws they had out east. But it was the home to President Dwight D. Eisenhower as a boy. His family followed the Chisholm Trail up to Abilene in 1900. One of the biggest problems Abilene had in those days were services. No one wanted to have anything to do with this reckless and unstable cowtown. What they needed was a welfare capitalist, someone who intended to make them concept. Clyson Brown was an Abilene native. It was famous for electrifying Kansas, starting up little utility services all over the state. Bell Telephone had run lines there, essential telegraph lines, but the service was terrible, as it was all over the new western frontier. Clyson's father operated a grist mill. That's the kind of mill where farmers would bring their wheat and oats to prepare them to be used in food. Sadly, Clyson lost his arm at the mill at the age of 10. Only having one arm in Abilene at that time really limited your options. Abilene Electric Works was his first venture in the early 90s, and by the mid-90s, Bell Telephone lost its patent, and that opened up the opportunity for companies to build their own competing telephone companies. Clyson founded Brown Telephone Company in 1899 and had his brother Jacob run it. This is an inauspicious beginning for an inauspicious company, which is what Sprint would remain throughout its history. Sprint began life as a little telephone company, started by a one-armed miller's son in one of the most inhospitable places on earth. This is no AT&T or Verizon. No, this is little guys, David versus Goliath. And that explained the company's culture right up until the very end, 122 years later. As it became viable, the Browns consolidated and expanded operations. United Utilities is the first phone company to offer exclusive direct dial service. For 1938, this is an incredible feat, and a necessary one, as the cost of maintaining operator switchboards for such a sparse population would have killed phone service otherwise. In 1891, a Kansas City undertaker named Almon Stalger suspected his local operator was routing calls to another mortuary. Almon was known for being handy, and with all the extra time on his hands, invented the Stalger switch, which allowed for direct dialing. The switch was used with very few changes worldwide for about 70 years. So it makes sense, since a happy coincidence of a smart welfare capitalist with a big regional utility was now knocking on Kansas City's door, that would be the first to widely use a new switch, invented and produced in Kansas City. For the next 25 years, the company began to grow at a brisk pace, moving its headquarters to a block west of the Missouri state line in Westwood, Kansas. With almost 600,000 telephones in 15 states, new President Paul H. Henson was seeing the company with a capacity issue once again. AT&T had switch buildings in nearly every city in America, but United could not afford that. The distance between customers was causing call quality issues too. So Paul created the first fiber optic network in the form of fiber ring around their headquarters. Fun fact, Google would later use that fiber ring to build out Google Fiber in Kansas City. By the time Henson left the company in 1990, this fiber optic network would span 23,000 miles. And long distance finally became profitable for another company that wasn't AT&T. In Abilene, they had a saying, be good or be good at it. And it turns out Paul Henson was good at it. To tell this part of the story, we have to go back, all the way back to 1860. To build out the railroads across the continent, railroads were not only given land, but given the land around the tracks. To claim the land, all they had to do was run tracks through it. It didn't matter much who owned the land. If the railroad thought they needed it, they just took it. Southern Pacific Railroad was doing this in 1860 and running telegraph wires next to the tracks, which they were charging Atlantic Telegraph, later to be known as AT&T, for their use. Clyson Brown struck a deal with Southern Pacific Railroad to lease the lines to him, forever. Later those lines were converted to fiber, Southern Pacific companies helped build that out. So 115 years after it began, AT&T sued Southern Pacific, claiming it did not have the right to give United Telephone those lines. And as you may have guessed, AT&T lost. United has the first competitive network to AT&T. To celebrate their success, United and Southern Pacific decided to join forces permanently, and a contest was held for the new company name. The new company would be called Southern Pacific Railroad and Turning Networking Telephony, or Sprint for short. 1982 would mark the end of Sprint as the way we know it, and it started a 40-year downward slide that would eventually kill the company. The second largest telephone conglomerate was General Telephone, or GTE. GTE operated local service in the Los Angeles area, and it challenged Pacific Bell for market share, something that was unheard of in those days. And GTE was on a spending spree, having just completed its acquisition of the Sheraton hotel chain. In 1983, GTE bought Sprint and merged it with parent company United Telecommunications 3 years later. Anyway, through a series of corporate moves, which are quite frankly too boring to review, 3 huge companies eventually gobbled each other up and the Sprint name remained. Sprint was finally making money on long distance, lowering the cost of just 10 cents a minute to its customers, a fraction of what AT&T was charging. Only MCI would be competitive in this space. Naturally, to move to mobile or cellular communications was the next logical step. So Sprint bought a couple of companies, a cell phone operator in Chicago and another company called 360 Communications, and launched the first digital phone network known as Sprint PCS. But this was a truly amazing step in mobile communications. The phones used far less power, and the calls were much clearer than traditional cellular. The 10 cents a minute theme continued with a $100 a month plan featuring 1,000 minutes. This was unheard of prior to that, but without the roaming agreements and sharing agreements of any kind, the Sprint PCS network was a huge moneymaker, even without good coverage. Sprint also made users buy their own phone. This costs a lot of money, so Sprint had to join forces with the devil, Cox Communications and Comcast, to launch their first market in Washington, D.C. By this time, Sprint was spread thin, really thin, and its financial future became questionable. They spent a lot of money on their retail store-within-a-store concept at Radio Shack in almost 2,000 locations. MCI WorldCom, who was at the time more valuable than Sprint, made a merger offer of $158 billion to buy Sprint, but it turns out MCI had been cooking the books, and the merger never happened. So for the next few years, the business stayed stagnant, which is not good if you're a high-tech service provider. Sprint quietly began to shed its wireline assets for cash.
Who is this?
I am Spectrum. The source, the nexus, the provider.
I think it's time to talk about Spectrum, not the cable TV provider, but the frequencies on which all wireless data run. Let's compare airlines to phone service providers for a minute. Let's say for a moment, and they did, Delta Airline operates 100 gates at Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky Airport. One day, Delta chooses to stop using those gates. Under normal logic, since the airport is run by a city, they could just sell that gate to JetBlue and they could fly wherever they wanted to out of it, or at least to the same destinations serviced by Delta. But that's not the way it works. Well, the city owns the gate. The airspace above the gates belongs to the people, you and me. That's why air traffic controllers are all federal employees. Periodically, airlines were allowed to buy a route. This includes the gate and the airspace sold to them as kind of a package. When Delta bought Pan Am's assets, they got Pan Am's gates. Even though Pan Am was not flying, and the fact it was bankrupt, Delta could still buy those gates as assets. So to delve in a little deeper, since the airlines usually lease their planes, it is fair to say that the air in which they fly is their asset. Mobile phone carriers work in much the same way. The lower frequencies are better as they can more easily penetrate buildings and the like. So if I am, say, the Polish airline LOT, and I want to fly a passenger from Warsaw to New York, I have to code share and fly them on another airline for the final leg of the trip. That's the way roaming works. Sprint will carry its own customer while they're driving down the street, but when they go inside a parking garage, Verizon carries a signal at a healthy price. Verizon can do this because they buy the premium spectrum, not from the other mobile carriers, but from the U.S. people at an auction. Here in the U.S., we have two, and they have CDMA as the American standard developed by Qualcomm, and at one point was considered the better standard in the U.S. Whether or not that was true is open to interpretation. Verizon and Sprint used that system, the European standard GSM. GSM was far cheaper to provide and had a larger coverage area, but initially at least did a poor job with data. It was therefore relegated to the lower cost carriers. So in the early days of data, Sprint had a big advantage. Even as this network was pretty poor by comparison to Verizon, since it was the only other CDMA carrier, it could roam on Verizon's great network, and Verizon could not sell that signal to any other carrier. In theory, as Sprint had most of its customers in the suburbs and around big cities, it could make a lot more money per customer than Verizon, because they were paying top dollar no matter who they served, and to dominate in business sales, creating additional expenses like advertising at expensive sporting events and putting their name on stadiums. So Sprint was potentially the Southwest Airlines of mobile phones, where Verizon was United. And in the early 2000s, the trends were looking Sprint's way. As it seemed clear that data was becoming more and more popular, Nextel, with a loyal but small customer base, they were early adopters of the BlackBerry Standard 2, which made them a bit inflexible. Sprint at that time was dying to be able to sell the BlackBerry. It is impossible to tell this part of the story without talking about Sprint's superstar CEO, Dan Hesse. Dan had been CEO of AT&T's mobile divisions prior to Sprint. Sprint had a reputation of being the carrier of last resort, and it certainly did not help the reputation. In 2003, Dave Chappelle's show sketch came out.
Just affecting things on Beach Street. Wall Street is having a big day as well. Our financial correspondent, Michael Peterson, is there. Michael, what's happening?
Chuck, a lot of activity, as you can imagine, here on the market. These people are spending money like hotcakes. Get this, Sprint stock has skyrocketed after the news that 2 million delinquent phone bills have been paid just this morning. Incredible. Gold is way up. Diamonds are at their most expensive level ever. Catchphrase around here is certainly bling bling.
There have been a lot of bad mergers over the years, AT&T, Time Warner, NBC, and well, everybody, but the Sprint-Nextel merger had to be in the top 5 worst. Sprint would double its subscriber base to 40 million, and many on Wall Street thought they were getting a sweetheart deal, paying almost nothing over Nextel's stock price. Perhaps the most valuable asset at Nextel were their engineers, and Sprint was light on engineers. But perhaps the worst part of the merger was the least quantifiable aspect, corporate culture. The Sprint and Nextel team feuded from the very beginning, immediately dividing along headquarters lines, which was a danger of not combining them. And with the Nextel engineers all in the Washington, D.C. area, they got new jobs in no time at all. This left Sprint with a dead mobile standard and the cost of shutting down a company with virtually no increase in business customers, which is what they felt like they needed. But others, especially Wall Street, disagreed. AT&T had been a small player with its GPRS, a modified GSM standard which made their network incompatible with other GSM carriers, but they had a lot of money, and they had the iPhone. The iPhone was rolled out by AT&T, and even as it hurt the reputation due to inadequate infrastructure, it barely affected Verizon's business but destroyed Sprint. Sprint was not ready. They tried various Palm products, but Palm demanded a lot of money, and they also promised an iPhone killer was just around the corner.
The Pre qualifies you for a TARP bailout. The Pre will cause you to lose 30 pounds. The Pre gives you the abs you've always wanted. The Pre changes diaper. The Pre uses alien technology, like warp drive.
So Sprint waited as its core customer base diminished faster than they could have ever imagined, as the iPhone was a complete game changer. Verizon had already chosen to partner with HTC or Hands-Free Telephone Corporation. It chose to compete or really not compete by offering early Android models. The news was not all bad. In the first quarter of 2008, Dan Hesse became CEO and immediately things began to change. Sprint's reputation for bad customer service, which in many cases was downright customer abuse.
And you can stop by taking that fake-ass weave out your hair. You showing up here like you looking like you're late for church, okay? Because I keep it 100.
Okay, what is happening here?
Woman, I still see you. You're gone. Damn, Donald, you was a crazy bitch. I just get angry sometimes, you know? You know what?
Would change almost overnight. But Hesse made some other moves, which clearly seemed to be smart decisions. First, he took Sprint's data service, made it unlimited, and introduced the first unlimited data plan for $99 per month. Then in response to AT&T exclusively having the iPhone, a deal which he had been responsible for, he made the deal with Samsung to develop new devices to run on Sprint's network exclusively. Prior to Hesse, Sprint lost about half its value and had massive layoffs while waiting for the Palm to release its miracle device that was going to save the company. And then it came, the Palm Pre.
Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work.
The Pre was a great device and should have saved Sprint, but Apple had already elevated the iPhone to a fashion brand, so it didn't matter what Sprint had, it was just not cool in the suburbanites in which they had built their entire company. And they started also selling to Verizon, so now they were not cool or exclusive. A couple of years, AT&T and Sprint had flipped market share from 30 to 14%, and Sprint had another problem. Just like the poorly managed airlines broken up in the 80s, Sprint was now sitting on more value in its assets than the total value of their stock. The next merger had given them something incredibly valuable: Spectrum. Not a lot of it, the spectrum equivalents of Manhattan's Upper East Side, the 800 megahertz. Sprint had always had spectrum, but was far less valuable at the 1900 and 2500 megahertz ranges. So Sprint found itself as a still important and relevant company with a value of $7 billion and assets worth nearly double that. Carl Icahn was wetting himself. But Hesse would not give up, at least not yet. After solving the customer service and product offering issues, he still had an even bigger issue to address: the merger of AT&T and T-Mobile. It would be Hesse and his testimony about the deleterious effect the merger would have on the industry, customer service, and pricing, which was credited by many to kill the merger. But Hesse also knew the writing was on the wall for Sprint. It had lost too many customers and recurring revenue to operate profitably. So in 2013, Hesse announced that Sprint would merge with T-Mobile. The issue of foreign ownership of an American utility, especially when it was a primary internet provider, scared Congress and the FTC.
The third largest telecom company behind Verizon and AT&T, the FCC is already studying AT&T's $48 billion bid for DirecTV and Comcast's $45 billion deal for Time Warner Cable. CBS News contributor and analyst Melody.
In the day the FTC moved to block the merger for the first time, CNBC was already proposing what a good merger it would be between Sprint and T-Mobile. Hesse, of course, agreed, but did not count on how heavy the AT&T opposition would be. A merger failing as the first try between Sprint and T-Mobile could be hard for a giant company like AT&T, but crushing for a smaller one like Sprint. Hesse had essentially started to think Sprint could not remain a going concern without T-Mobile's help. So when the merger ultimately failed, Sprint became unfocused and now needed a new investor, and right away. Still a cheap buy for the right company, Dish Network's parent company EchoStar Communications made an offer they thought would make for a quick sale. But since they had so badly managed Blockbuster, the FCC stepped in and made it, shall we say, convenient for EchoStar to step aside, which they did. Given their performance since that time, I think it was a good move, as Sprint would have just faded away, leaving this world with no value at all. And their Japanese telecommunications provider, SoftBank. SoftBank thought they could give it the old college try, replacing upper management with their own talented staff, even moving some from Tokyo to Kansas City. This would be the end of Hesse, however. As hard as he tried, Sprint was just too weak and had been mismanaged for too long for Hesse to save it. Unfortunately, just as Sprint had seen with Nextel, the corporate cultures clashed. And in general, the easygoing Midwestern nature of the staff clashed with the Japanese. Almost immediately, the internal struggles at Sprint became the stuff of public domain, and SoftBank put it out the for sale sign again. The federal government quashed the T-Mobile Sprint deal. SoftBank decided to sell the Sprint campus in Overland Park, Kansas for about $250 million, maybe as little as half what it was really worth. This was a mess, just like everything else it seemed was a mess at Sprint. In a complicated deal with a Wichita company, it would buy the property and lease over half of it back to SoftBank, who would divide that portion evenly between Sprint and its other troubled company, WeWork. And then there was a fallout from the Radio Shack disaster. In 1996, Radio Shack agreed to a store-in-a-store concept where a Sprint employee would work in Radio Shack selling service. But employee layoffs quickly made it impossible for Sprint to keep up. Radio Shack also accused Sprint of withholding all its good phones for their company-run stores in direct order. During its 2015 bankruptcy, Sprint offered to buy good Radio Shack locations and convert them to Sprint stores. And where Radio Shack refused, they would just build a Sprint store nearby. Finally, in 2017, Radio Shack's creditors sued Sprint. This cost SoftBank a lot of cash and further devalued its asset. Marcelo Clare is a 6.6-inch Bolivian who came to the U.S. in the mid-90s and co-founded a company that sold phones. Brightstar was based in Miami, where he partnered with Jennifer Lopez and tried to establish a professional soccer franchise with David Beckham. Sprint would release reports that made them sound like a wounded bird, basically saying they could not justify investing in 5G and their market position was likely to continue to drop. Reading between the lines, the "Take My Wife Please" message was clear. SoftBank was really over Sprint and just wanted to go home to his ramen and K-cars, and so it did. This story is also unique and it really has no epilogue. One day the merger was completed, and the next day the Sprint Center became the T-Mobile Center. And that was once yellow turned pink. It was a quiet revolution, and no one seemed to care.